Okay, the next system that we'll start is the nervous system, and that begins with chapter 11, which is really an overview of the nervous system, and then we'll kind of chapter by chapter dig a little deeper into different parts of the nervous system. So let's just kind of look at a few overview items for the nervous system, beginning with some of its main functions. Now, the nervous system is one of the two main controlling systems of the body, regulating type systems. Now, all of the systems have some type of regulation or homeostasis, but nervous system and then endocrine system is another controlling or regulating type system. But the nervous system helps to control perception, how you perceive different things of the world and the experience that you have. And by doing this, it helps to direct voluntary movements. And of course, that's going to be through the muscles that we just learned about. It's going to be because of the brain and the central nervous system, the area of consciousness, personality, learning, and memory, and then many different aspects of homeostasis. And again, along with the endocrine system, helps to balance many of your, much of your physiology, your respiration rate, your blood pressure, body temp, your sleep and wake cycles, how you're going to sleep, when you're waking up, and then and then your blood's pH, which we'll see eventually as well. Now, to understand the nervous system, you generally break it down into different divisions, and so some of the main components or parts of the nervous system include the brain and the spinal cord, and then you have many different nerves coming out of both of those, but mainly out of the spinal cord, and then that goes out to sensory receptors that are there to perceive and to get all of the needed information, and that takes it back to the brain. But two main subdivisions that you have of the nervous system include the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we have different chapters dealing with each one of these. I'm just going to introduce these two briefly here, and then we'll look at these more closer a little later. The central nervous system is basically your brain and your spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system is the other sections, the sensory receptors and the nerves. And so make sure you go through, your textbook and the chapter and the notes and kind of look at some of the diagrams. This is just a basic diagram kind of outlining those two main subdivisions. Central nervous system is the brain, and then the spinal cord that runs the length of the trunk or the body cavity, and then all of these lines coming out, all of these are periphery nerves, and so these are part of your peripheral nervous system. That does include some cranial nerves. These are nerves coming off of the brain, and we'll talk about those in another chapter. But the cranial nerves are coming off of the brain. Most of them are staying right around the head and the face. There is one or two that kind of permeate out through the body. And then you have many different spinal nerves going out to all of the areas of the body, and that's part of the peripheral nervous system as well. So let's look closer at the peripheral nervous system. And again, there is another chapter that will look at this a little more detail, but a little bit more of the peripheral nervous system. It includes those receptors. Those receptors have the ability to detect all kinds of sensations, including temperature and pain and touch and pressure and all these things, light, sound, odors, all of that is part of your sensory receptors' ability to detect all of these different aspects. And then the nerves, basically a nerve is a bundle of axons, which we'll talk about momentarily. That's, the axon, the part of the neuron cell coming out away from the neuron cell body. So you have a bundle of axons and then a protective sheath that goes around the axons. We'll see that a little bit later as well. This helps, this connects to the central nervous system and the sensory receptors, and then goes out, these nerves go out to the sensory receptors, out to muscles, and out to your glands. Now, we saw on the last slide that you do have cranial nerves. There's basically 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and we'll see those a little later. And then spinal nerves, basically 31 different pairs of spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can be broken down as well, and so that's usually in two subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system, the sensory and the motor. The sensory division of the peripheral nervous system is sending the information from the sensory receptors back to the central nervous system, back to the brain and spinal cord. And then the motor division of the peripheral nervous system is going the opposite direction. It's sending signals from the brain and spinal cord out to what are called the effectors, which include your muscles and your glands. Then if you take a look at the motor division, it's also subdivided into two different sections or divisions. The first one is called somatic. the somatic division of the nervous system. It's sending signals from the brain and spinal cord out to your skeletal muscles. Right, so this is what's controlling all of your muscle movements. You're sending a signal through the peripheral nervous system, through the motor division, and it's through the somatic portion of the motor division that's sending signals to get your body to move, just like the soccer player is in the diagram. This is under voluntary control. That means you control it, and it's based on what's called a single neuron system. The second division of the motor division is the autonomic nervous system. A lot of people think of this as automatic, but it's referred to as autonomic nervous system. It's, again, sending signals from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, but in this case, it's going out to things that are involuntarily controlled, like your smooth muscle that is inside of many of your organs, or that lines the blood vessels, that causes your blood vessels to constrict or to dilate. It's going out to the muscle, the cardiac muscle that's in your heart, and it's going out to some of your glands. So this is involuntarily controlled. It is being controlled, but that's through your subconscious type processes. And it is what's called a two-neuron system. That just means you have kind of a bridge system here. So you send the signal out from the brain and the spinal cord, the CNS. It goes to like a sub-relay station called a ganglion. Then that sends a signal on to the effector, whether the effector is a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or some of the glands. Always make sure you're looking at some of the diagrams in the textbook and through the PowerPoint lecture, figure 11.3. This just kind of gives you a good summary of each of these divisions. You see the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and what they do. And then the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. Remember, it's subdivided, and so you've got the somatic division sending and the visceral sensory here. This is sending sensory information back to the central nervous system. It's how your brain picks up information for all the different senses. And then your brain, your central nervous system, is sending out through the motor division, and that's subdivided into the somatic, going to the skeletal muscles for movement, or going to autonomic, which is like your smooth muscle and cardiac muscle in your glands. Then lastly, we can look at subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. And really there's two main ones, although we'll mention all three of these here. Two main ones, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is generally what's active during physical activity. So your body's moving, exercising, moving around. That's going to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. It's what's usually causing your heart rate to increase. Let's say you're exercising, your heart rate goes up, your respiration, you're breathing faster, respiration goes up. That's all because of your sympathetic nervous system. It's also what's referred to as a fight or flight type scenario. Maybe you're in some kind of traumatic event, and your body tries to prepare itself, or tries to send the resources to the locations that will best help you get out of that particular scenario. Maybe it's some kind of, again, traumatic event. You've got an injury or whatever, traumatic injury. It's the body's way to try to help you get those resources, get the blood supply to the brain and to the skeletal muscles where it needs to go, so you have the best chance of getting out of that scenario. It also helps to maintain homeostasis as well. Usually you can think of sympathetic as speeding things up. It doesn't always, but usually it tries to speed things up, like your heart rate, your respiration rate, your blood flow to your muscles. Parasympathetic generally is the division of autonomic nervous system at rest. It's regulating things. This is part of your subconscious. It's regulating things like digestion and kidney filtration. It also has the effect of slowing things down. So your parasympathetic nervous system actually can help to slow down the heart rate if it gets too elevated. Then there's actually a third division called the enteric division. And this is it's a subtype of a nervous system that's controlling your digestion. It's controlling the digestive processes. We'll see that in another chapter, but it's controlling the digestive tract, and it's really independent of what's going on in the brain and the spinal cord. Now in section 2, we need to look at a little closer of nerve tissue. Now we talked about nervous tissue back in chapter 4 when we looked at the tissues in general, but we need to take a closer look and look at the cells a little closer. The main nerve tissue you're going to find, the main cells, are called neurons, They're the specialized cells. We've looked at these before, but these are the specialized cells that have the ability to receive some kind of stimuli, and they also transmit those action potentials or electrical signals. Then you have a different cell type called Neuroglia, and these are helping type cells. They help to support and protect the neurons, and so we'll look at several examples of these cells. So again, let's review a little bit about the neuron, the main cell type here. Remember that the neuron, like in the picture here is composed of a large cell body with a nucleus on the inside, and then you have many dendrites coming in. This is sending action potentials will be carried in toward the cell body. Most of the time they're relatively short. Compared to an axon, they're relatively short. Many times they're very branched. That's where the word comes from. Dendrite refers to branching. And you kind of see these kind of coming in into the cell body. The axons, this is coming out of the cell body, and there's a series of terms here that are associated with some of the anatomy of the axons. We can kind of look at some of these on the picture here. So for example, again, we mentioned the nucleus, we see the cell body, the axon hillock. This is kind of the area where that action potential is generated, and you see the axon coming out. Many times sometimes there is a branch here off of the axon, but many times it's just a single axon coming out. This is carrying the action potential away from the cell body. The axoplasm is just the cytoplasm of the axon cell body here. Sometimes you see what are called Nissl bodies inside of the cell, and these are specialized ribosomes that help to produce proteins inside of the cell. And of course, there's mitochondria inside of here as well. The presynaptic terminals and the synaptic vesicles. The presynaptic terminal is at the other extreme here, or the axon terminals, and so we'll be talking about that location because that's where the action potential goes from the axon over to the next cell, over to the target cell, whether it's a gland or it's a muscle cell or whatever that cell is, or it could be another axon. And then inside of these axon terminals, you would have storage vesicles, and we'll talk about that, storage vesicles called synaptic vesicles that are storing your neurotransmitters. Let's look at a couple of types of neurons, and this is based on their function. You have sensory neurons, and they use kind of the same terminology that we saw before. Sensory neurons are carrying action potentials back toward the CNS. And motor neurons, this is carrying action potentials away from the CNS, and sometimes they use these terminologies as well. Afferent is going toward a structure, in this case toward the central nervous system. Efferent is going away from a structure, exiting a structure, and so this is going away from the CNS. Sometimes you find interneurons. Inter means between, and so these are between one neuron and the next neuron, so you kind of have a go-between type neuron as well. Then you've got other structural examples of neurons. Most of the time when we've seen these so far, and in chapter 4, the neurons we were looking at look kind of like this first one, the multipolar neuron. You've got all the little dendrites coming in, a single axon coming out. And so that's a multipolar. That's what you're going to find mostly in the brain and the spinal cord. That's what's sending signals out to your muscles, so motor neuron. Bipolar neurons, these have the cell body here and more of a streamlined dendrite coming in, not as branched, just a single dendrite coming in. And this is what you'll find. This is what's called bipolar. You have kind of equal structures on both sides of the cell body. And this is where you'll find these inside of the eye and the nose for sensory receptors there. And then out in your sensory areas, most of your sensory areas, say your skin and in your organs mainly, you're going to find unipolar type neurons where they have a cell body here, and really the axon is branched into areas here, and you'll have sensory receptors on one end, and that's where you're picking up all the different stimuli such as temperature or pain or any type of feeling from your organs or from your skin. Now let's look at some of the helping cells, the neuroglial cells or glial cells. And so the central nervous system has what are called astrocytes. Astrocytes, their main function is to provide a protective layer over the neurons, but also over some capillaries as well. So look at the picture here. Here's an astrocyte. You can kind of see why it's called an astrocyte, because it has appendages out that kind of makes it look star-like. And there's the cell body. And these appendages come out of the cell and wrap around what it's near, the structures it's close by. So sometimes it's wrap around the neuron close by here, and then many times it's wrapping around capillaries that are in the central nervous system. And this creates what's called the blood-brain barrier, or helps to create this. This allows for an extra layer of protection, so certain chemicals or harmful substances can't pass from the bloodstream out and actually affect the neurons that are inside of the central nervous system. And so that blood-brain barrier helps to protect the neurons in certain locations, the brain and spinal cord, from toxic substances. It does allow for your basic diffusion processes. So it still allows for nutrients to get to the brain tissue and to the brain cells and to the neurons there. It does allow for waste products to pass through, but certain chemicals and certain toxins can't penetrate this. The second type of glial cell or neuroglial cell that you'll find in the central nervous system is something called an ependymal cell. These are specialized cells that you're going to find in the brain and the spinal cord that are basically producing and secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. You find in the brain the ventricles. These are chambers inside of the brain. That's where these cells are going to be located. They're basically gland-type cells, and so you can kind of see how they're mainly cuboidal shaped cells. They're gland cells. They're producing the cerebrospinal fluid, and that helps to basically cleanse a portion of the brain and the spinal cord. A third type that we'll find is called a microglial cell, and this is basically a white blood cell or a macrophage, and its job is to help in protection, help in the immune system. And so this helps to phagocytize necrotic tissue. Phagocytosis, process we've talked about before, where a cell basically engulfs or eats something else. And so these are large cells called macrophages that help to protect the body. They help get rid of some microorganisms. They help to get rid of some necrotic tissue or dead and maybe broken down cell debris or some kind of foreign substance. A third type is called an oligodendrocyte. This particular cell type, similar to an astrocyte in that it has long extensions that wrap around the nerves. In this case, it's wrapping around the axon. And so you can kind of see in the diagram, you've got several. Here's the axon coming out of a nerve cell here, and you've got several of these oligodendrocytes coming out, and their appendages wrap around the axon. And what that does is it creates what's called a myelin sheath, or basically like an insulation type covering, so the action potential can travel very, very quickly through the axon without being disrupted. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, you have two main types of neuroglial cells, Schwann cell and a satellite cell, and both of these are there for protection, really, of the neurons. And so you can kind of see in the diagram here, the Schwann cell, it basically wraps around the axon again, and that's again providing some insulation properties for the axon, so that action potential can travel very, very quickly through here if it's insulated. It's kind of like having a insulation around a copper wire in electricity. And so the cell body has the satellite cells that help protect the actual cell body. So this myelin sheath is very important in certain areas. It helps to protect the axons. It helps to insulate the axons. It helps actually speed up the transmission of the action potential. So you're sending a signal faster if it's myelinated. And it has, because of the satellite cells and things, it actually helps repair axons if they're damaged. And so I'll show you a picture of this again, and we'll talk about something called a node of Ranvier. And then also, if you're familiar with the disease called multiple sclerosis, or MS. This is a problem where the myelin sheath gets broken down. And it's an autoimmune disorder where antibodies start breaking down some of that myelin sheath, and you have many different problems in the nervous system. There are some areas, though, that are unmyelinated. They don't normally have the myelin sheath wrapped around them on those particular nerves. And so take a look at this particular diagram. Again, we have a neuron. You can see the cell body, the nucleus, the dendrites coming in, the axon hillock where the action potential is going to be generated, the axon coming out, and then you've got the little pieces of the Schwann cell that are wrapped around. That's creating the myelin sheath. That's the insulation that's protecting that that axon. And in between, you've got little nodes, little areas here called nodes, and that actually helps speed up the process of the action potential as it travels. And the last couple things when you look at here is the gray matter and white matter. We'll be looking at this when we study the brain, but there are places in the brain that are unmyelinated. They don't need that myelin here, that myelin sheath, and they function just fine. This is the gray matter portion of the brain. It's mainly composed of cell bodies and the dendrites, not the axons, so that's why they don't have the myelin sheath there. They just have the cell bodies and the dendrites, and they do have the helping cells. The white matter portion of the brain, it's white because it has all that myelin sheath, so it kind of appears white. It's mainly made out of the axon portion. And so that's, if you did a cross-section, we'll do this in a lab section. You do a cross-section of the brain, and you can see areas that are gray, mostly toward the outside of the area, and then closer to the inside, you see the white matter.